Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to Lloyd's Tuesday with Lloyd session, broadcasting to you live today from the RIMS conference in San Francisco. I'm Hank Watkins, Regional Director of Lloyd's in the Americas, and I'm very excited today to bring to you our two special guests. Soraya Wright is VP of Strategic Initiatives at RIMS and a board member. And Senator John Sununu is also Lloyd's council member. They'll both be talking today about emerging risks, systemic risks, a number of the challenges we're facing, not just as an industry, but as a people around the humanitarian crisis currently ongoing in Ukraine. We've got about 30 to 45 minutes of the conversation, and I believe we're going to have opportunities for Q&A as well. So without further ado, Soraya and John, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank.
Thanks, Hank.
And I'm so excited.
Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited about this conversation and to gain your insights. So let's just jump right in. You know, the outbreak of the war in Ukraine has just changed the macroeconomic and geopolitical picture. We're in a global pandemic. We've seen, how climate has impacted Mother Nature in our world. So with, all of these issues or events and the new norm seems to be focused on all of these emerging issues, what should risk professionals in the insurance sector do to prepare and balance between the new events and unexpected future events?
Well, it's an extraordinary time. And as we look back over the last few years, we've seen things and experienced things in terms of the pandemic and now what we're seeing in Ukraine and in Europe that we probably did not think we would ever see. But, one of the themes that we come back to as insurers and as a marketplace at Lloyd's is really a lot of these events, they couldn't necessarily be predicted, but they weren't unforeseen. I mean, truly, and the pandemic is a good example. As dramatic as the impact has been, and as difficult as it might have been to imagine some of the consequences, we've dealt with pandemics before. It's SARS and MERS. So as risk professionals, as insurers and risk managers, we can't say that the pandemic was completely unforeseen, and maybe more importantly, as difficult as the impact has been from an economic and social, cultural standpoint, there are things that our companies and our marketplace could do to mitigate those risks, even in the case of something as significant as a pandemic. So, first and foremost, I think it's important, even as we want so desperately, and we're excited to move forward from the pandemic, right? Let's move forward. In our business, it's important that we look back and that we try to learn and try to understand from this difficult experience so that we do an even better job of managing risk and mitigating risk and diversifying our risks so that at the end of the day, what do insurers do? We help our clients offload and pool and distribute those risks that they don't want to take and take on the risks that they do want to take. And for me, it's a matter of using that insurance in this case, but there are other ways of mitigating risk to build resilience. Right? Resilience gives the companies we work for confidence, gives our management team confidence, so that management team can make investments and allocate capital and grow, right? So it's our chairman, Bruce Carnegie Brown, likes to use the phrase, sharing risk to build a braver world, right? We all want to be brave, we all want to be confident, and I think that's an important part of the industry. So I'd start with that observation. I'd also sort of look at the situation in Ukraine specifically now, and observe one, for Lloyd's marketplace, the direct impact is small. It's substantially less than 1% of our gross written premiums. But there's no question there are secondary impacts due to the trade sanctions that are imposed, due to the restrictions on energy now moving into Europe, the expropriation of some assets within Russia. So those secondary impacts will be a little bit more meaningful, and so this will be a substantial a loss, fall into the substantial loss category for Lloyd's, but all of our operating tolerances are sort of within expectations. The central fund is stronger than it's been in years. Our central solvency ratio is 388%, which is up 100% from 2018. So this is not a situation without challenges, but as a marketplace, we're certainly confident in our ability to deal with the losses. So finally, on this point, let me share two thoughts. One, Ukraine shows us, or reminds us, how connected we all are, right? We just talked about the secondary impacts. It's not just the tragic consequences of the war and the loss associated with the war, but the secondary impacts on energy and inflation, supply chain, and cyber-related issues. So, and we saw that in the pandemic as well, right? It's a health crisis that turned into or resulted in an economic crisis, huge social implications, and even as we're still feeling now, the health crisis had significant supply chain implications all over the world. And one of the reasons for that is because of this connectedness. I think it's fair to say if we had a similar event 30 or 40 years ago, the impact on the supply chain almost certainly wouldn't have been the same, because our global economy wasn't as intricately and as complexly as it didn't have the same complicated interdependencies that we have today. So the connectedness, I think, is something for all of those in the risk management profession to be intimately aware of. And then the other observation I would make about these low probability but high impact events like the pandemic or the events in Ukraine, and we can go back to 9/11 or the tsunami in 2004, Fukushima, the financial crisis. These are low probability events, but enormous impacts, and the kind of connected and secondary impacts I was talking about. They happen. I mean, we've got to be cognizant of that, and we can't live in a world where we think that bad things aren't going to happen in the future if we just buy enough insurance. They are going to happen. So that's what makes the work that we do in the risk management profession so important, right? We can mitigate those risks. We need to insure against those risks, but we need to learn from them so that moving forward we can do a better job of building resilience.
Yes. And I agree. We've talked about pandemics, we've experienced them, we've experienced a number of crises, but this feels a little bit different. And it's almost like we're prepared for this, right? And that's what we do. So in some respects, it seems like, oh, these are emerging critical issues, but we've prepared and we help businesses, right? What role does insurance play? We've been preparing for it. We have expertise.
Absolutely. As I described, the goal is to sort of distribute and pool and share the risks that you want to manage or that you want to avoid. And then obviously to take the risks that you think are appropriate for your company and your situation. I think as Lloyd's, one of the strengths that we've had as a marketplace and that I think is more important than ever is in innovating, right? And trying to think trying to learn from these situations and understand what's new, what's different about them, and then how do we move forward, create new products, new technologies that can help people manage that risk. And look, historically, examples of that where we participated very, very directly was in the development of cyber insurance, the development of the nuclear risk insurance, political risk insurance, which 20 or 30 years ago were sort of new markets, emerging markets and emerging products, and today are they're I don't want to say run of the mill, but they're everywhere. You can, but at the same time, we saw. Most recently in Ukraine, that cyber is going to continue to be a real threat, right? So that's an area where we need to continue to innovate, continue to provide capital, make sure that we have adequate capital to deal with the cyber threats that are out there. I think in terms of natural disasters, one of the more exciting innovations and technologies are on the parametric insurance side. So, at Lloyd's, we've done two things in this area. One, we've helped to launch, a number of parametric insurers. Most recently, the first parametric insurer to deal with cyclonic activity, and I think that's an area and a field given. The climate impacts and the fact that we continue to develop extensively in coastal areas, that's going to be a field that just more and more important over time. And then even equally importantly, we've helped to put together a disaster risk facility, which was capitalized at, I think, $450 million to help developing countries more effectively mitigate risk and prepare for natural catastrophes. So, innovation, I think, it's a core of Lloyd's marketplace, but also it's essential for the risk management profession, on the corporate side, to adapt to the new kinds of challenges we're going to face in the corporate world and senior management and boardrooms around the world.
Do you think businesses are too focused on current events and as opposed to also thinking about the unexpected?
Yeah, good question. So I sit on a couple of public company boards, and so it's been exciting for me to sort of try to carry some of these ideas and thoughts about risk management that I'm able to better understand and work on at Lloyd's, sort of into the boardroom, as it were. Now, I'm fairly optimistic here. I do think, from my personal experience and conversations with some of my peers, that the idea and the concept of risk management and risk mitigation is a higher priority in the boardroom today than ever before, and that's quite possibly two things, right? Because we've seen these events, just go over the last 5 or 6 years. These are serious, dramatic global events that have had an impact on any company that's doing business internationally, certainly, and a lot that are simply domestic here in the U.S. So there's a cognizance of the impact of crises and natural disasters and those that are man-made, but also because these companies are more interconnected and global than ever before. So again, 30 years ago, most American companies wouldn't have been impacted by the supply chain disruptions caused by COVID that they ended up being. So I do think there's a greater cognizance on enterprise risk management. Now, the real challenge, I think, is within your business, developing the skills that don't just identify the risk, but help deal with it in a way that's effective and the most appropriate way for your organization. And we'll come to supply chain. And this is, I think this is one that touches a lot of different companies. We talk about supply chain resilience. We've seen big disruptions in the supply chains around the world. Well, what does that really mean? And how do you mitigate, right? Do you deal with supply chain issues? Do you build supply chain resilience by just having a huge stock of the material you need? Do you deal with it by bringing the manufacturing of that component or that element in-house? Do you deal with it by going to multiple suppliers around the world? There are going to be different answers for different companies. But depending on the issue, that's a question and a choice that oftentimes should be made at the highest levels of the corporation. I mean, and even at times, not always, but at times a board level decision. Because choosing the right mitigation strategy, whether it's dealing with natural disasters or supply chain or political risk or cyber, choosing the right solution often means making a big commitment in terms of capital allocation. And so, again, my experience is that board members are more focused and aware of these issues, that risk management teams are more sophisticated than ever, and certainly in identifying the risks. And I think the challenge is going to be to continue for companies to continue to invest in and train the risk management teams on mitigation strategies, how you analyze pros and cons of different strategies, and how you present them to management. Because everyone that's ever worked in a company has had the experience where they think they have the right idea and the right answer and the right solution, and they present it to management, and the management doesn't always make what they think is the right decision. And so whether it's communication or the decision making, this is an area where getting the answer right is really important.
I agree. As a risk professional, I am excited that, these conversations are, increasing at the board level. And, this is the risk professional's dream, right?
Yeah.
To have take that seat at the table and to help and work with boards. I'm gonna, when we think about what's happened over the past couple of years and, and witnesses step change in our perception and approach to climate change. As we face this decisive moment in our fight against climate change and the transition to net zero, where do you see opportunities for risk and insurance professionals to add value?
Well, I think unfortunately, one of the outfalls of the conflict in Ukraine has been to sort of expose us all to the cost of lack of resilience, and in this case, in the area of energy. The impact has been severe, much more severe in European countries, obviously, who were sort of engaged in a very aggressive transition to carbon reduction. And I think sort of the first lesson we have to take is that as much as we value the process of reducing our carbon footprints, the transition isn't without risk, right? So you set a target, you set a goal, you move toward it, but you have to be cognizant of the risks that are presented there. And I think, perhaps that was in some ways a failing, because as we all know, the impact in Europe has been very dramatic. So, at Lloyd's, we're focused on ensuring the transition. We talked a little bit about sort of innovation and new products, but also it means working with new industries to identify the products that are right for them. So whether it's building or ensuring and monitoring and improving the resilience of our electricity grid, whether it's, ensuring the new classes of electric vehicles who, given the battery technology, might have different needs than internal combustion engines or storage. I mean, we all understand that when you're trying to build a grid using wind and solar power, storage becomes ever more important. And we are in the process of building out new types of storage, larger volumes of storage, and I think all of these things are going to require their own tailored approach to both to insurance, but also to protection, right? To sort of making sure that they last. And that they're safe and that they're secure from a lot of the other risks that we just talked about. So, I think that's, for me, that's the exciting challenge of any transition, but certainly this one is making sure that we effectively insure the risks and help reduce the costs associated with that transition.
Great. I want to switch back and jump back and talk about the crisis in Ukraine. What do you think the wider implications are?
Well, I think long term, it's at the corporate level, for those in the risk management profession, to think more deeply about the kinds of exposures that this has raised. So, political risk is one that I mentioned. I think a lot of people and a lot of companies and even those in the risk management profession wouldn't have looked at Central Europe, 3, 4, 5 years ago and said, how are we covered for political risk in this region? It just wouldn't have been a priority, I think. We talked about cyber, right? So, go back a year, 18 months, I think a lot of us were thinking about cyber more as ransomware, and which is appropriate. I mean, that's a real risk out there, but we weren't necessarily thinking about the kind of cyber threat that might come from a real world conflict, again, in Europe. And suddenly the potential exists for one of the combatants to engage in organized cyber attacks against different companies or countries around the world. Supply chain, right? So to think about, a lot of people have been focused on supply chain around the Pacific Rim, and for good reason, because of the impacts of COVID. But the events in the invasion of Ukraine has certainly created certain kinds of supply chain issues and problems for participants in the region. So I think the longer term ramification on the risk management side is to really think more broadly about the potential exposures around the world, even if they're low probability. You have to think through the potential impact and then, ask the honest question of, are there modest steps that can be taken to mitigate that risk? And you're not going to eliminate it, but risk mitigation and resilience, it's not just important to reduce your costs or your exposure as a firm. It can really become a competitive advantage, right? If you're manufacturing medical devices and your supply chains are more robust and more resilient than your peers and your competitors, when there are dislocations, when there are shocks, you're in a better position to compete. So it's not just about protecting your bottom line, and we didn't lose as much money because of the supply chain disruptions. It can become a competitive advantage, and I do think that risk management teams and senior management are recognizing that more and more. Sometimes, unfortunately, because we've gone through these crises and they've seen cases where they did manage the risk and prepare well. And it became an advantage. And so I think that will sort of inspire these teams to continue to do the right thing.
I agree, and I think, the whole discussion about supply chain, but even broader than that, the whole value chain of every organization, and to gain deeper insights and have a heightened focus on all those critical,
Yeah.
stages. So I agree.
And I do think, one of the other effects, though, at the macro level, one of the other effects and a potential long-term risk is the implication of continuing sanctions. So, politically, I think the U.S. Congress is likely to keep sanctions in place, to perhaps look for other areas where they can extend the sanctions. I mean, that has real-world implications, of course, for companies that either previously or currently are still doing business in Russia. But again, companies working in certain areas for whom the sanctions have resulted in higher cost of goods, higher rates of inflation. I think those are impacts that aren't likely to recede, even if, as we all hope, we reach a point where there's a truce or a cessation of fighting. I think it's changed the political dynamics in Central Europe, and again, that's something that senior managers and risk management teams really need to be cognizant of.
You think as a result, there will be even more discussions about political risk coverage and also consideration for expanding political risk coverage? I
do. I think that's inevitable. I think it's wise. If you go back to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, from 1993 to certainly the year 2000, I think there was a sense that while there were still conflicts and risks all around the world, the trend was sort of in the positive direction. Now, that doesn't mean that people weren't buying political risk insurance, but I think it wasn't something that rose to the top of mind in discussions of risk managers or corporate boards. I think that's changed. It certainly, I think, has changed in the last 3 or 4 years, both, of course, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also because of the growing tensions and a trade war with China in particular. So I think any company that's doing work around the world has to recognize that not every political system is as stable as the United States. And even in the United States, sometimes we wake up and we look at Washington and we wonder what's happening. And that's said as someone who used to work there. So yeah, the political risk is real. The important message is it's something that we can insure against. It's something that we have been insuring against for years. And I just think it needs to rise to the top of mind in corporate boards today.
I agree. Thank you so much for your insights.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
We've been chatting here. Want to see you.
Maybe someone has a really hard question that you can answer. Because you're a risk management professional and I'm not.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I thought your last point about the end of the Soviet Empire and the way we all sort of, it was not only like you're thinking, all right, all this stuff is done, we're post-conflict. I think there's been sort of a narrative in government and narrative in the media that we're post-conflict. So I felt that the Ukraine thing caught everyone by surprise. And I was wondering, as a former government insider, that sort of thing, is there a deeper level of understanding that doesn't make it into the political narrative? Was the government caught by surprise? And should we all be thinking, that maybe the Cold War isn't actually over?
Sure. Well, it depends a little bit on your time horizon. So in the months leading up to the invasion, I think our intelligence services had a pretty good sense of what might happen. But I think if you go back, even after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, which was abhorrent and shocking, but even after that, I think most people observing, and those in government observing Ukraine and Russia would not have anticipated a military invasion. So I think that was unexpected. I could argue that was partially a failure of our intelligence services. And I mean, not our intelligence services aren't going to get everything right every time, but I think that was quite significant. But as you point out in your question, it was partly due to the mindset, not just in America, but around the world, that perhaps over time we're moving away from these types of conflicts, and the scope of the conflict in Ukraine is I think the most stunning and alarming and shocking and dismaying thing. That it's not this isn't guerrilla activity in a province, between, it's not an ethnic rivalry per se. This is large scale military action that a lot of people thought they wouldn't see in Europe in their lifetime.
Thank you. Thank you for asking the question.
The question for Soraya: you've been in the risk management world for most of your career. Have you found this change in perception by pretty much everybody in the world around what risk is? Better understanding what it could be personally and for your business. You see an increase in the interest by young people. We have a lot of students clearly in our country that study risk management full time, enter the industry. Has there been enough time to determine if that increase, that interest has increased dramatically, or do you think it's going to continue over time?
I love your question, because I'm working very hard to recruit new professionals or talent to the profession, and I think it's just a great opportunity. So to answer the first part of your question, I believe and have experienced an enhanced role, and more engagement. And when I started my career, it was focused more at the operational level. And over time, as we've experienced around the globe a number of crises, and with organizations I represented, issues, the discussion is elevated to the point where, it's at the board level. And so I think it's great, because I also think that as you think about strategic risk or managing enterprise risk and having conversations to talk about how you can, work with leaders to manage and think about risk as opportunity too, because you have to go through and manage through issues. I just think that it's enhanced the profession in a way, and given more visibility to the advice and the work that we do. So the answer is yes. A different level of engagement at all levels of the organization, but especially at the board level. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for talent. So for those of you who are watching and those of you in the room, yes, I think there will continue to be opportunities. And the last point I'll say is risk management, when I started my career, was more narrowly focused on insurance. Yeah. And that's a good thing, and it's a good base. And it's broadened to include, just the whole portfolio of risk. But you need to understand and manage this portfolio in thinking about mitigation. So, no, it's been a wonderful journey, and not only a great journey, but I think it's time to recognize.
I couldn't agree more that one, it is more important than ever. It's visible at a higher level within the corporation than ever, and everyone from the bottom level of a corporation to the top wants to be working on something that's viewed as important and central. So that's exciting, and I think it is a change, say, over the last decade. But I would add to it, this is an area where the potential for technology to solve and address problems and improve performance is just beginning. Just beginning. And, you know, we all use the example of the parametrics, looking, you know, at movements in the earth to pay out claims on earthquake or cyclonic activity that might pay out automatically. But there's, you know, the use of satellite data or drones to improve the risk management in agriculture, to better identify areas prone to flooding, to make better choices about building and about, again, protection and mitigation. And that's exciting, I think, for new entrants, for students, for young people who are looking at, you know, potential paths of employment to, you know, move into a field where there's where latest technology is being deployed to solve old problems. I mean, you know, risk and natural disaster. I mean, these are old problems, but to solve them and to deal with them in new ways. And, you know, using the very latest technology in terms of sensor, surveillance, satellite, analytics, AI. I mean, we're all aware of that. This is all happening in the industry now, but I think we all have the sense that we've only scratched the surface. And I would think for students, for young people, for people in college right now, that provides a lot of exciting opportunity.
And it will continue to grow, right?
Yes.
I think it's,
yeah.
We have arrived.
Risk is a growth industry.
Yeah.
It's you know, for better or for worse, risk is a growth industry. Thank you, Soraya.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Nice job.